Welcome to the English Epics channel. For the past half hour he had been watching his stunning wife make her way through the ballroom, ensuring that by midnight, when the ball dropped, she would be as far away from her husband as possible. Surrounded by wealthy, self-satisfied peers, she would be passed around like a platter of hors d'oeuvres, kissed and caressed by every executive from his workplace, and with particular fondness by his wealthy from birth imbecile boss. He knew this because the company's New Year's party had played out exactly like this for the past 2 years. The first year he accepted it, blaming everything on the excessive amount of champagne. But last year the trumpets had sounded too loudly, and he had begun making preparations. Feeling a tug on his coat, he turned to face Deidre, Josephine's best friend and accomplice. "Happy New Year, Mike," she exclaimed, stretching up to pull his head down for the obligatory annual pity kiss. He barely brushed his lips against hers before pulling back and looking into her hazel eyes. Deidre was another socialite, a trust fund child like his wife, but from an even wealthier family than Josephine's. He expected to see the usual sly smirk she often gave him, a smirk that implied she knew something he didn't, because she was bold money just like his wife and his boss. Instead, he saw two unfamiliar emotions on her face: pity and concern. "Mike, don't take it so seriously," she said. "She's just exchanging kisses. It's an old New Year's tradition. She'll be back in a little while, no worse for wear. And she'll show you once again how much she loves you." He gave her a skeptical look. Deidre tried to reassure him. "She really does love you, you know. It's just that she's very sociable, lively, and impulsive, whereas you're intellectual and reserved. Sometimes she needs a chance to be around others who are more like her. But the time she spends with them only strengthens her love for you." "Oh really, Deidre? Is that why she spent the entire Christmas party at her company under the mistletoe with her colleagues? We go to her Christmas party, and she spends the night dancing and kissing her firm's executives. And here at my company's New Year's ball, she's spending the whole night dancing and kissing and kissing. No, let's call it what it is, licking my company's executives. So by kissing everyone at the party except me, she's somehow starting to appreciate me more. Fascinating concept. Tell me, is kissing George the imbecile a dozen times another New Year's tradition? Or is that just her way of showing how much she loves me, knowing how deeply I despise that man?" To Deidre's credit, she had enough composure to look embarrassed. She couldn't hold my gaze, so she turned away and tried again. "Mike, I can see you're upset, but you have to understand." "Really, Deidre? I think I do understand. For the first time in 5 years of marriage, I think I actually do understand." I turned my back to her, went back to our table, pulled out the briefcase I had placed underneath it, and retrieved a fairly large, brightly wrapped package. Still facing away from her, I removed the ring from my finger and tied it to the center of the bow she would have to untie to open the package. Turning back to Deidre, I held out the package. "I'm leaving now. Please give this to your friend when, or if she manages to free herself from the grip of the men surrounding her. Pass along my congratulations on the new year. And let her know that I hope she gets everything she deserves in the coming year." I turned to leave, but Deidre grabbed my arm. "Don't go, Mike. I'll go get her. She's had too much champagne again. You need to take her home." "No, Deidre, there's no need. She's booked a room here at the hotel. She's been here all day, entertaining men while I was working. Of course, you already know that, since you were here with her. She has her own car, clothes, and everything else she needs. I'm sure at least one of the gentlemen she's currently kissing will be more than happy to make her happy. Maybe all of them will. Don't look at me like that. You told me the same lies last year. I gave her this year to decide. She's made her decision, and so have I. Goodbye, Deidre. I can't say I won't feel relieved to never see you again." As I walked out of the ballroom, I nodded to Helen, the HR director, with whom I had spent the first half of the day while my boss and his friends were helping sort things out at the hotel. In reality, he was in a luxury suite paid for with the company credit card, having sex with my wife. Actually, I should say they were in the suite, having sex with my wife. And I have photos and videos to prove it. Helen has them too, and the chairman of the board will be receiving them within minutes. After I left the ballroom, Helen and her husband headed toward the crowd of men surrounding Josephine. Deidre was pushing her way through the throng, many of whom persistently tried to kiss her in honor of the grand tradition. Several men tried to approach Helen, but they seemed deterred by the stern glare of her husband, a former football linebacker. Helen made her way through the crowd to George Burke, the CEO, and his companion, reaching them just ahead of Deidre. She stopped her husband a few meters away and watched. The startled look on Deidre's face and her sharp cry of Josephine's name caught Joe's attention, prompting her to break away from George's embrace. She round when she saw her friend's frightened expression, while Helen smirked. Deidre handed Josephine the elegantly wrapped gift and said something. Joe took the package, leaned in closer and seemed to ask Deidre to repeat herself. "Mike left this for you?" Deidre exclaimed, "He's gone, Joe. He saw you flirting and getting handsy all night, and when you started kissing all these men, he handed me this package and left." Joe smiled. "Oh, you know, Mike, he has these little tantrums whenever I don't pay attention to him for a few minutes. I'll go home, apologize, make him feel like a fool, and everything will be fine that he loves me. See, even when he's angry, he still leaves me a gift. Let's see what it is." "Joe, I don't think it's a gift," Deidre began, but Joe was already untying the ribbon to open the package. When the ring fell to the ground, she paused, frowned, and asked, "What is this?" George bent down, picked it up, held it out to her, and smirked. "Isn't this your husband's wedding ring?" She stopped tearing the wrapping paper, looked at him in confusion, and took the ring. Then she glanced at Deidre, who muttered, "I tried to tell you." Joe began tearing off the wrapping paper from the package and found a white gift box inside. Relieved, she smiled, shook the box, and said, "It's heavy." Then she started cutting the tape on each side with her fingernail. When the tape on the third side tore, the contents of the box spilled out and scattered across the floor. She crouched down to pick up the glossy sheets that had fallen. Others crouched beside her, gathering those that had slid near them. Suddenly, everyone froze. Joe's eyes widened, and she screamed, "N.O." Her cry caught the attention of those nearby, and even more people gathered around their circle. Deidre's eyes widened in disbelief as well. She looked up and saw the expression of horror on George's face. He picked up a glossy, colorful 20 by 30 centimeters photograph lying at his feet, held it against his expensive suit, and involuntarily shouted, "What the hell?" Joe loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Everyone stared at the photograph scattered across the floor and saw Joe engaging in sexual acts with people who were not her husband. There were numerous photos of Joe and George, as well as Joe with other executives from Mike's company, colleagues, and Joe's own bosses. While they didn't cover every position from the Kama Sutra, Mike had done a thorough job selecting photos that proved Josephine was open to all kinds of sex with men, women, or toys in any combination and with any number of participants. Confronted with the photographic evidence of her sexual escapades, Joe fainted. She collapsed backward, and only George's quickly extended foot prevented her head from striking the tiled floor and likely suffering a concussion. Deidre dropped to her knees beside Joe, lifted her head, lightly slapped her face, and frantically shouted, "Joe! Joe! Are you okay, Joe? Talk to me, Joe! Are you all right?" While both women lay on the floor, others began picking up the photographs and examining them. One woman turned around and slapped her husband with all her strength as he stared down at a photo he was holding. "You cheating bastard, no wonder you don't have any energy left for me." He stared at her in stunned silence until she swung her handbag and struck him directly in the right eye. Clutching his eye, he screamed in pain and collapsed to the floor when she kicked him in the groin with her sharp-toed shoe. The woman knelt down and began methodically sorting through the photographs scattered across the floor. She paused, looked up, and announced, "Those of you married to the management of Taylor & Sons might want to pick up some of these photographs and take a closer look. There are photos of other husbands here, too, having sex with these adulteresses. If you'd like to save on divorce lawyer fees, call me and I'll try to arrange a group rate." 9 other women dropped to their knees and started examining the photographs, while the men began backing away. "There are flash drives here, too," one of the women announced loudly. "No telling what's on them." "You filthy bastard," a stunning blonde shouted at a well-dressed older man. "Remember our prenup? You're bankrupt, you scumbag, baby." "I'm sorry, it didn't mean anything. She kept coming on to me, and eventually I gave in, but it was only once and she wasn't even as good as you, Anne." "You lying bastard," the blonde screamed, shoving 2 more photos in his face. The blonde got up from the floor, murder in her eyes, and stormed toward him, waving the photos and swearing up a storm. He stumbled backward, then turned and bolted out of the room. Another woman was sobbing, clutching her chest with one hand and waving a photo in a footer. Her husband, face buried in his hands, was crying too, that a man held up a photo, displaying it to the elegant woman standing before him, and shouted, "What the hell is this? You, an adulteress, kept telling me I'd never get a threesome because you'd never be with another woman." She turned beet red, spun around, and staggered away on her 10-centimeter heels. Another woman picked half a dozen photos from the pile and, walking to the center of the ballroom, began calling out names. A confused woman stopped her, took a photo, stared at it, and with murder written all over her face, turned to her husband. He began backing away as she charged toward him, brandishing the photograph. This scene repeated itself 5 more times, and each time the accused men received a good smack to both their ears and their egos. Joe had already regained consciousness and was watching the chaos around her with glazed eyes. A man in an expensive tuxedo knelt down beside her and asked, "Are you all right?" She looked at him curiously and nodded. He then asked, "Who are you? Can I help?" "I am Josephine, Lord," she replied grimly. "But I don't think anyone can help me right now." "You're Josephine Reynolds, Lord?" he asked incredulously. She nodded and asked, "Yes, I am." "And who are you?" The man handed her a stack of papers he had been carrying, took a photo of her with his phone, and loudly declared, "I am a court officer and you've officially been served. Josephine Reynolds, Lord. These documents, along with the attached photographs and video recordings, provide evidence of the adultery referenced in Michael Morris Lord's divorce filing." He turned to the large crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you haven't had a chance to review the photographs, simply request a copy of the divorce documents, which are public records available online. They list the names of everyone Joe S.L. has had sex with over the past year, as well as where and when. For a nominal fee, I can provide a link to Joe S.L.'s website, where her exploits since January 1st of last year are fully documented if you'd like to review them to determine whether your husband or wife was involved in a 2-person, 3-person, 4-person, or even larger group sexual encounter with S.L. You can contact me online, and for a nominal fee, I'll provide the link to her site. For an additional fee, I can provide digital copies of the participants' activities. Such evidence may prove extremely useful in court. I look forward to your call." He gave a deep bow and walked away, leaving behind tears, fear, and panic. For this stunt, he would probably end up in hell, but he had been paid very, very well for it. Besides, this was New York, and his office was in New Jersey, where his family wielded considerable influence. Joe was still holding the divorce papers in her lap, leaning back into her friend's arms, her mouth agape in bewilderment. She looked at the faces gathered around her and saw hatred, pity, anger, and unease. The admiration, lust, and envy she had known throughout her privileged life were completely absent, and the magnitude of her loss and humiliation finally became clear. She clung to Deidre once again and buried her face in her friend's chest. Sobbing inconsolably, George Taylor ordered his lackeys pick up those damn photographs and burn them. Looking directly at Helen, he commanded, "I want a reprimand letter for Mike Lord on my desk by Monday, and beneath it, his termination papers." With a neutral expression, Helen replied, "I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, but Mr. Lord resigned earlier today. He gave 2 weeks' notice used as accrued leave, which you approved last week, collected all his belongings and materials, and left the building. I won't accept his resignation. I'll fire him after the reprimand. He'll never work in this business again. Once again, I'm sorry, Mr. Taylor, but before leaving, he met with the chairman of the board and your father accepted his resignation. Mr. Lord already has another job with one of the firms he consulted for. With your written permission, sir." Taylor's face was so red that onlookers feared he might have a stroke as he muttered loud curses aimed at his father and Mike Lord. Helen and her husband watched his outburst with delight, squeezing each other's hands in excitement while, of course, maintaining neutral expressions. Meanwhile, Mike Lord was driving out of New York in his new all-wheel drive Chevrolet with a 6.2-liter turbo diesel engine customized beyond the standard package. He had specially ordered the SUV in the fall when the new models were released, and it had been delivered to him just yesterday. The GPS indicated that the drive to his new home in Austin, Texas, via his chosen route, would take 24 hours and 32 minutes. He knew, however, that it would actually take most of the week because a country boy from Idaho planned to soak up the culture of the rural states he would pass through. Once he reached Virginia, he intended to leave the main highways, drive along the back roads John Denver sang about, and visit the small towns Mary Chapin Carpenter celebrated in her songs. He planned to sample homemade jellies and jams sold in roadside stands and small local shops, and to eat where the locals dined, far from highways, hurried crowds, and the frantic lifestyle he had grown to despise. Their checking and savings accounts had been divided, but not before he purchased his SUV, since she had earned 10 times more than him throughout their marriage. The $88,000 vehicle hardly evened the score, but he was happy to use at least some of her money for the purchase. Under the terms he proposed, he would keep his investments and retirement accounts and she would keep hers. He was leaving her the penthouse and making no claim to her trust fund, provided she accepted his generous terms and signed the divorce papers within 10 days. The radio was tuned to the best traditional country station. Joe hated country music almost as much as she hated retro music. Therefore, the next station would be classical. Now he was the master of his own life, not the clueless cuckold she had made him out to be for at least 2 years. He had taken control of his life when the New Year's ball dropped last year and had spent the entire year preparing. Perhaps Taylor and Sons would survive his departure, but he strongly doubted it. Working under George's inept leadership and stripped of the many design improvements and patents Mike had brought to the company over the past 5 years, he expected it to collapse within a year or two. He smiled at the thought, knowing that his work had accounted for more than half of the company's new sales and profits in the previous year, and that he had even better designs and innovations ready to launch as soon as his new company was up and running. Oh, his old boss, the current chairman of the board and George's father, Randolph Taylor, would likely sell the business before it completely failed. But George would be exposed to the world as the incompetent fraud he was long before that happened. The thought made Mike smile. Tonight, he had publicly exposed George and his own adulterous wife as immoral and unprincipled societal rejects. Over the next year, he would reveal George's ineptitude as a businessman when his new company crushed the old one like a bug smeared across a windshield. The thought of it made him smile again. He wouldn't have minded being the fly on the wall to witness Josephine's parents learning about his stunt at the ball. Helen had already called to tell him how brilliantly it all turned out. The fact that she scattered the photographs all over the ballroom exceeded his wildest dreams, even though he had intentionally designed the box to fall apart once the tape was cut on 3 sides. Her parents had always looked down on him and were alarmed when their precious, perfect daughter decided to marry him. After all, he didn't even have an Ivy League education. The fact that his engineering degree from the Colorado School of Mines and his master's from the University of Michigan made him highly sought after in his field didn't matter to them. Better a liberal arts degree from Brown than such a mediocre pedigree? He smiled, thinking about the destruction he had caused and the destruction he was yet to cause. Deidre and her husband Albert drove Josephine home. As soon as they entered the house and she looked around, Joe started sobbing again. On the way home, she had been rehearsing what she would say to Mike. She planned to explain that her affairs meant nothing to her and didn't harm their marriage. They were just a break or an attempt to influence decisions that affected her and Mike to make their life better. Recreational sex only helped them. She had planned to argue. It brought her back under control when she felt out of sorts, and she had learned things she used to please her husband and spice up their love life that sounded ridiculous even to her, and she knew Mike wouldn't buy it. The truth was, he had always been a firm believer in their marriage vows. Even talking about partner swapping or role-playing with others enraged him. So why did she think he'd fall for the nonsense she was about to pitch? Deep down, she knew her marriage was already over. But stepping into their apartment, seeing that all his belongings were gone, she realized she had dug the hole she now found herself in. She sank to the floor, crying bitterly and cursing her own arrogance. She had no prepared explanation for her actions because she never believed she would be caught. And even if she were, she thought she could convince her sweet, naive husband to forgive her. For 3 years she had been successful, but tonight he had burned her marriage and her reputation to the ground. The week passed quickly for Mike. He had cloned his SIM card before tossing the old one into the dirty city snow, allowing him to initiate contact if necessary while ensuring no one could interrupt his journey through the Old South to his new home in Texas. The automated emails he had scheduled were sent out throughout the week, one by one. Spouses received personalized messages with attachments, and marriage after marriage went up in flames. The thought of this outcome brought a smile to Mike's face. The email to Deidre's husband had been sent yesterday. Thinking about L's likely response made Mike grin widely. Joe was responsible for her own actions, but Deidre's tales of the pleasure she derived from being an adulteress and her persuasive encouragement for her friend to share the joy by spreading her legs had certainly influenced Joe's decisions. It was now the 4th day. And back in New York, Deidre and Joe sat on the couch in their apartment, now their apartment. Since Alabama had kicked Deidre out after receiving the email and watching the video included 5 clips of sexual encounters and an enlightening conversation between Joe and Deidre in which they described their conquests and pleasures, listed their lovers by name, and occasionally laughed at their clueless husbands. Albert had forwarded copies of that conversation to the wives of the named men, at least the ones he knew, and he knew most of them. The fire was spreading, and Albert smiled as he watched it burn. George wasn't faring any better. His father had fired him and disinherited him. In fact, he had terminated all the senior executives responsible for tarnishing the company's reputation due to their actions. He had taken over as acting CEO while the new vice president of talent acquisition development, Helen, recruited top managers from around the world. Mike passed the exit for Martin Luther King Boulevard and prepared to turn on to Cesar Chavez St. Driving past the Austin Convention Center. He saw Lady Bird Lake to his left, cross Congress Ave, and arrived at the exclusive high-rise apartment building provided by his new company. The rent was paid for 6 months, giving him time to find the home with trees and the lawn he had always dreamed of. Once he got settled, he planned to buy a dog and start looking for a new partner, someone reliable who would enjoy building a home for him and their future children. His new business partners had already planned a barbecue where they would introduce him as recently divorced, promising plenty of suitable women would be in attendance. Meanwhile, back in New York, the fire continued to spread. Exposed spouses were throwing others under the bus, and betrayed partners were sharing what they knew about other betrayed partners. Helen kept Mike updated on the events that he watched, the ever-growing flames of the massive New York scandal he had ignited, and smiled. The more he heard, the happier he was to have moved to Texas. Thank you for listening until the end. See you in the next episode of English Epics. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.